First of all, I would like to thank Loyola University Chicago School of Law and the people at ProLaw for the organization of this conference, especially Professor McNerney, which is in the other room, Professor Bill Loris, Helena, Vanessa, and everybody that made this conference possible. It's good to be back. As they already mentioned, I'm a ProLaw graduate, so I'm returning for the first time since I graduated. It feels very good. And, well, thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit about my research. And, well, now down to business. The name of my still working paper is Complexity and Corruption, the Need for a Synthetic Understanding of Corruption in Mexico. In the title, I include the main topics of the paper, which are number 1, complexity, number 2, corruption, and number 3, how corruption viewed through the lens of complexity, or within the mindset of complexity thinking, if you will, how corruption seen through these new eyes can give us a new understanding of the problem, an understanding that is transdisciplinary, that is to say that it runs across multiple fields of knowledge, and in consequence, it allows us to comprehend and explain a synthesis of corruption. And I will return to this idea of synthesis in a little bit. So let's get started. This is the general content of the presentation. First, I will provide some key definitions. Second, I will explain the problem that I found while doing my research. Third, I'll build on that problem and explain my objective in the paper. Afterwards, I think that it is important to discuss why corruption is a complex problem, because not all problems are complex. So corruption, it may appear, it may seem like very obvious that it is complex, but nevertheless, I think it's important to talk a little bit about it. So finally, I will provide some concluding remarks at the end. So let's talk about the key definitions. First, I mentioned the word synthesis, and this word is important because the objective of the paper is to achieve a synthetic account, a synthetic understanding of corruption. So what is synthesis? The idea comes from a Colombian philosopher and complexity thinker named Carlos Maldonado. And he says that to think within the complexity paradigm is to think a synthesis. And in order to come up with a synthesis of a problem, one must think in cross, inter, trans, and multidisciplinary terms. In here, for example, the majority of us are lawyers. We come from a legal background. And we have been disciplined within the legal discourse and within legal frameworks. And this is fine when we try to solve legal problems. But it is not fine when we try to solve complex problems, because complex are multidisciplinary. So this poses a problem because we are trained to think in linear terms and in legal terms, try to solve every problem that we come across with. So if we were to think in complex terms or as synthesis, our understanding of the problem would not be fed only by legal discourse, but also by concepts, methodologies, practices from different fields of knowledge. That is to say, from sociology, from semiotics, from economics, from behavioral economics, psychology, anthropology, etc., etc., etc. So this means that to think a synthesis is also to dialogue in multiple discourses. This poses the problem of specialization, a problem which complexity thinkers must overcome. And lastly, Dr. Maldonado says that to think a synthesis is to embody a highly critical spirit because as we know, a synthesis is always changing. We echo the Hegelian philosophy of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So we need to always keep a critical spirit and constantly change and evolve our thinking. So this why is this important for my research? Well, because right now there is no synthetic understanding of corruption. I mean, there is very few studies which takes into account all the multiple fields of knowledge and creates one single account of corruption. The literature addresses the problem from the legal perspective, from the philosopher's perspective, from ethics, from the economist perspective of incentives, but no one has really taken all those discourses and made sense of a complete and synthetic account of corruption. So, right now we will not do that because that takes a lot of time, but for now we will understand corruption just as a perversion from good to bad. So a very open definition, if you will, that when seen through the eyes of complexity, this type of corruption shows characteristics of a complex network. That is, it is nonlinear, it is independent, each element is independent, they are dynamic, and we will return to this in a little bit. So we understand corruption in a broad sense, and corruption in a broad sense is to be understood as this. This is just only an image. You don't have to try to understand. It's just in our understanding of corruption, we imagine these highly complex networks where millions of nodes are interconnected and permanently exchanging information. So the dots, corruption is a whole network, not the dots nor the lines. The dots represent people, history, institutions, psychology, discourse, natural catastrophes, envy, peer pressure, moral blindness, incentives, any concept that can ultimately contribute to a corrupt act in linear or non-linear ways. So we have to imagine that in a certain society maybe there's a language behaves in such a way that it promotes corruption, for example. So this is how I understand corruption in my paper. Now, imagine that researchers, when studying corruption, they focus only on a single dot. That is the problem that I perceived or tried to perceive in when doing my research. There is no synthetic study, or there is no study that makes sense of how all these concepts relate to each other for the emergence of corruption. So that is the problem that I address in the paper. As we said, there is no synthetic, and so why is this? I think that this is because, you sure know, the linear or Newtonian paradigm has greatly influenced the social sciences, and I think that this influence is also in corruption studies, because as I mentioned, literature on corruption is isolated, is compartmentalized from each field of knowledge, and there are no communicating vessels from the findings of each one of the disciplines. And ultimately, this is a problem because this translates into linear public policies that deal with corruption, assuming that it is linear in nature. So, Having this said, our objective in our paper, we suggest that corruption research needs to adopt a transdisciplinary method when studying its causes. That is to say, there is a need to understand the problem through the new eyes, through the eyes of complexity. In other words, we need a synthesis of corruption. Because this, I think, will ultimately lead into better public policies. So a synthetic understanding of corruption, I suggest, or I think, that will open the minds of policymakers and allow them to visualize the problem with new eyes and propose innovative ideas, out of the box measures that maybe don't really deal with the problem in a linear way, such as accountability and transparency, but other measures that we cannot imagine right now. But I'm thinking about film and discourse and education and stuff like that. So what now I'm going to do is try to explain why why corruption shows complex behavior, because I think this is necessary to open up the conversation in the search for this synthetic understanding that I'm proposing. So I will now talk a little bit and very fast about corruption and nonlinearity, corruption and emergence, and corruption as a dynamic organisms. These three concepts are concepts that are frequently used in complexity theory. And I chose them out of simple arbitrary choice. No, I chose them because I think they're the most popular concepts in complexity theory. So further research must show that corruption also behaves or is related with other concepts in complexity theory. So first, corruption and nonlinearity. We may think about, when we think about corruption, we may think about all the nonlinear causes that mingle together, that converge, that interact, that ultimately leads to a single individual to commit a corrupt act. And this idea can be visualized like this funnel. All those nodes, all those things that happen is culture, history, personal history, motivations, etc., etc. An example I found in the web, this image where you have this adult man. I imagine he's the father of the kid that is in the back. The adult man is giving money to a police officer. I took this from a video on YouTube, so sorry for the quality of the image, but it shows that the kid in the back is seeing his father giving money to a police officer. So the chances that kid is going to be corrupt are higher than a kid that didn't see that. And so now imagine that kid makes it to public office 20 years later, and that he is convicted for a crime related with corruption. And when the prosecutor is prosecuting, the prosecutor will not say, hey, you committed the corrupt crime because when you were a kid you saw your father giving money to a police officer. No, because there's no linear relationship between the act of corruption and this. However, this does have influence in this is a nonlinear cause for that kid being corrupt in the future. So these are the type of nonlinear causes that I imagine in my paper. And I just showed this simple example for this presentation, but in my paper I actually propose other examples, like for film film in Mexico is a very it proposes a very corrupt narrative without a counterbalance for honesty, and I think that that is a nonlinear cause that perpetuates corruption. And there's tons of others of causes that can be identified. So I leave it at that. The second concept of complexity and its relation with corruption is emergence. We have already talked a lot of it. I here use the mayonnaise metaphor. If nobody knows mayonnaise and I show those three ingredients, maybe you cannot imagine in your head that when you join those ingredients, you will have mayonnaise. So emergence is, as we have said, unpredictable. But as well, if you only have the emergent phenomena, it is difficult to separate its individual elements, and if you don't know what makes up mayonnaise, it is difficult from simply tasting mayonnaise to arrive at its individual elements. So the emergent phenomena has these two characteristics. It is unpredictable, and once you have it, it is impossible to identify from where it came from. So what I say in my paper is corruption is like mayonnaise.
Okay, you get another 4 minutes.
Corruption is like mayonnaise. So you have this is the way that I visualize. You have all these elements contributing factors that are out there in society, and they somehow merge for in every personal life of everybody, and somehow they impact and lead that person to commit a corrupt action. So this visualization, I use it only for explanatory purposes, but in reality, it's not like this, because this shows linear relationships between each concept and corruption, when in reality, as we mentioned in the previous, in the one of the first slides, the corrupt network is something like this. So the task is to comprehend how these elements combine in such a way that they ultimately lead a single person to engage in corrupt behavior. This comprehension, I suggest in my paper, will allow researchers to propose new ideas on how to reduce corruption. However, we must consider that any intervention in this network can cause unforeseeable consequences, because the network is alive and is dynamic. And this leads me to the third characteristic of corruption and complexity. Corruption as a dynamic organism. And here the metaphor, the most famous metaphor, is bacterial diseases. So research has proved that bacteria develop a resistance if you apply a therapy compound against it, and over time it evolves a defense mechanism. So if you attack the bacteria, you actually strengthen it. So I think something similar happens to the network of corruption, or at least in some cases, or in many cases. So for example, in Mexico, in the year 2000, there's this famous political event, the democratic transition, which it was supposed to help Mexico develop our institutions, and but now suppose that circle represents year 2000, and the blue represents honesty, and the red represents corruption. But now we have greater corruption than in the year 2000. So and greater corruption is exactly attributed to that political event of democratic transition. And the reasons for that, I'm not going to dwell into it, but it has to do with power mechanisms, that the central authority lost power and more power went to the governors. So the governors became completely corrupt. So now we're here. So that is why corruption is, or any policy that is applied to the corruption network should take into account that it might either alleviate the problem or make it worse. So with this, I mentioned a little bit policy implications about what are the policy implications if we think of corruption in complex terms, and what I say is that right now Mexico has a very ambitious anti-corruption program. I think the most ambitious anti-corruption program in its history. And it's called the National Anti-Corruption System. And this system, what I'm saying, it just deals with one or two, three nodes of the whole network. Why? Because it assumes that corruption emerges out of incentives. So what the system really does at the end is increase the chances of going to jail. That's it. That's all it does. And as you sure know, that doesn't work in deterring crime. And in this case, it doesn't work in deterring corruption. So what I propose in the paper is to tell policymakers that they need to adopt a multidimensional and transdisciplinary perspective on corruption in order for them, when designing policy, somehow they need to implement this transdisciplinarity, or maybe in a communication aspect to communicate it in different ways. Or I'm not suggesting any policy measures right now, but I think that understanding corruption through complexity may allow policymakers to engage with the problem in a different way. So the concluding remarks, is I identified a paradox in my paper. So on the one hand, I say that a linear understanding of corruption produces linear public policies. However, I also support the idea of local custom-made policies designed to attack specific areas of the network. And in a way, these strategies are linear because they amount to, they are designed to alleviate a specific problem. However, and I think this is a contradiction, because I'm saying, hey, don't deal it with linear strategies, and I'm also saying, hey, deal it with very specific measures or very specific problems. And it's a contradiction, but I think that a way out of this paradox or contradiction is a very simple, but I think that it can be very profound. I think that policymakers or people in general should know or should keep in mind that when they make a contribution to the network of corruption, that contribution evolves and ultimately has disproportionate impact, very great impact on the network. And again, when they refrain from being corrupt, they may see it as a loss. They may see it as something that has very little impact in the whole network of corruption. But I think that if we see it in complexity terms, I think that every little impact can count, ultimately evolving into honest behavior to the whole system. And I think that is ultimately the challenge for policymakers, to somehow communicate the idea that no matter how small the contribution, the honest contribution to the network, it will eventually evolve into changing the network as a whole. So, and I please don't think that I'm proposing measures like more accountability or more transparency. I'm proposing radical nations of radical different nature. I'm saying attack the problem from language, attack it from semiotics, attack it from religion. This is why we need to take our codes away and stop being lawyers and think it in transdisciplinary ways. So that is basically well. Just one more comment. I only talked about corruption and its nonlinear causes, how they interact and ultimately lead a single individual to commit a corrupt act. But we can also think in complexity terms of all the nonlinear effects. But that is a topic for the next conference, maybe next year.
During the tea break.
So that's it.
Thank you.